purpose of today's video is to give you exposure to more information covered on where is agriculture distributed from the cultural landscape, but to do this in a manner in which you don't have to do additional reading. But I am going to be covering some of the topics that are not assigned to you in terms of reading for this chapter. Before we began with this video, I asked you to look at the maps on pages 316 and 317. And I asked you, what similarities do you see between agricultural and climate maps? Two of the examples that the book gives are that they show a relationship between areas where there's pastoral nomadism and dry climate, and shifting cultivation and tropical climates. It's important to understand that geographers do not believe in sort of a predetermined idea of what agriculture could happen in what climates, but that there's a relationship between the types of climates that a community has and the types of agricultural decisions that they make. Whitley sees classification of agricultural regions is an important idea for you as geographers to understand. He came up with 11 different agricultural regions, and he divided them between developing and developed countries. In this video, we are going to talk about the 5 agricultural regions of developing countries, and then later on you are going to do a reading about the agricultural regions for developed countries. So to start off, before agriculture was invented, most people, all people, lived in small groups of 50 as hunters and gatherers. They traveled frequently. We believe that men hunted and fished, and that women collected berries, nuts, and roots. Most people are not hunters and gatherers anymore, but it is important to understand that even in this modern period, there are some people that are hunters and gatherers. Nowadays, less than 0.0005% of the world's population still survive as hunters and gatherers, and 2 examples that the book gives are the Pila Nguru people from Australia's Great Victorian Desert and the San people from Botswana and Namibia in Africa. If you look at the map, what it's highlighting is pastoral nomadism and where that happens in the world. Pastoral nomadism is when people herd domesticated animals. It generally happens in dry climates, but it happens where planting crops is impossible or difficult, and so instead they rely on herding domesticated animals. These people still consume mostly grain, and they either raise that grain themselves or they trade with other people so they could get access to grain. They control an area, and their modern examples of pastoral nomadism would be the Bedouins in Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, and North Africa. And I had the ability to meet with a group of Bedouins when I was traveling in the Middle East. And also the Maasai people in East Africa. They would also be an example of a pastoral nomadism. Pastoral nomadism is decreasing as a form of agriculture because of technology, but also because governments are increasingly forcing groups of people to stop doing this type of agriculture because it requires a large amount of space in order to do this type of agriculture, and the governments frequently in these developing countries want that land for other purposes. Another type of environment would be tropical regions, and there's also subsistence agriculture done there, and it falls under several different categories. We're going to start off first with what's known as shifting cultivation. So shifting cultivation is practiced in tropical regions with high temperatures and abundant rainfall in places like sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Some of it is also done in Latin America. It is a practice of sustainable rotational shifting cultivation practices of indigenous people, according to agricultural anthropologist Malcolm Cairns in National Geographic. There is a common practice to shifting cultivation. It has several steps. First, most of the trees and shrubs are cut down in a relatively small patch of forest where they are left to dry. In a few days, the withered vegetation is burned to put the nutrients back into the soil and to preparation for planting crops. This practice makes the use of artificial fertilizers unnecessary. After 1 or 2 growing seasons, the field is then rested, the forest returns, and then the cycle is repeated. Shifting cultivation actually absorbs significantly more carbon than it releases. One, because not a lot of space is burned, but second of all, because the actual fallow land is used as a place to absorb the carbon dioxide, both in the growing trees, but also in the soil itself. An example of shifting cultivation from National Geographic is in northern Thailand. They cut small patches of forest, they grow crops, and then let the trees regrow, but they don't clear cut in this part of northern Thailand. The result is good harvests and a happy woods. It's also referred to it as Swidden agriculture. The ownership of land in shifting cultivation is traditionally communal. Frequently, the village will own a large section of land, and then it will be used in this rotating purpose. 1/4 of the land in the world is used for shifting cultivation, but less than 5% of people actually conduct this type of agriculture. And so it requires a lot more space than the space use to people use is not really proportional. The future of shifting cultivation is difficult. It is being replaced by logging, by cattle ranching, and by cash crops. People frequently sort of conflate shifting cultivation with slash and burn agriculture, but based on what I was able to read, it seems that these two things are not exactly the same. Slash and burn agriculture is a technique used to clear patches of land for plantation use. Farmers cut down part of the vegetation on a patch of land and then set fire to the remainder. And sometimes it is done on peats, and that means that the fire then takes off and is very difficult to stop. In 2013, a slash and burn fire in Indonesia released a huge volume of greenhouse gases. This slash and burn method is not done in the same ecologically thoughtful way as shifting cultivation, and it's done very quickly. And that quickness of the process makes it much more cost effective. It makes it easier to grow a crop. It makes it easier to grow a large crop. Indonesia has made slash and burn agriculture actually legal now because of its devastation on the environment. However, it is still being pursued as a way to clear land for large plantations, particularly for palm oil plantations. And environmentalists argue that slash and burn agriculture continues in places like Indonesia because of governmental corruption, and that prevents the government from actually going out and enforcing it. Slash and burn agriculture can clear land and support crops for 3 years or less, and then that land has to rest and for somewhere between 6 to 20 years again in order to be able to be used again. Examples of where this type of slash and burn agriculture happens would include Indonesia, and Western Africa, like the Ivory Coast, Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon. Western Africa grows about 70% of the global cocoa supply. Cocoa production doubled between 1987 and 2007 because of slash and burn agriculture. And so it is used as a quick way in order to make cash crops, in order to be able to really increase the amount of money that is coming into a community or a country. As I said before, frequently this type of slash and burn agriculture is used to create way for plantation farming. Plantation agriculture is a form of commercial farming where crops are grown for profit, as opposed to subsistence agriculture where crops are being grown to feed a community. Large land areas are needed for this type of agriculture for plantation farming. Countries that have plantation agriculture usually experience high annual temperatures and receive high annual rainfall, and they grow very profitable tropical crops like cotton, sugarcane, coffee, rubber, tobacco, cocoa, jute, bananas, tea, coconuts, and again, palm oil, like I said before. Subsistence agriculture and population concentrations. what I think is important in talking about for the characteristics of intensive subsistence farming would be that 3/4 of the people in developing countries do this type of farming. So it is actually the most common type of farming that happens in developing countries. It feeds the most people in the developing world. And it is work that is done by hand or with animals. It is generally speaking not done by technology because that would be too expensive for people to be able to own. When people are doing this type of subsistence agriculture and population concentrations, they do not waste the land. They really want to use as much of the land as possible in order to be able to get as much food as possible. One term that's important when studying this type of agriculture would be double cropping. Double cropping would be when you have 2 harvests per year. So for example, in parts of Asia, they grow wet rice in summer, and then they grow a dry crop like wheat, barley, or another crop in wintertime. There are 2 types of sort of areas in terms of thinking about this rice production. There's wet rice dominant and there's wet rice not dominant. Wet rice dominant is where the dominant agriculture is rice. And the areas for this are like Southeast Asia, East India, and most of Southeast Asia actually produces 50% of the world's rice. And so that is definitely a significant crop there. Wet rice not dominant is where what we would refer to as the interior of India, as well as northeast China. In those places, they grow wheat and barley, and the land is used intensively by humans and is cultivated intensively by humans and animals. A technique that they use is crop rotation, which is that they would rotate different from field to field. They would use different crops year to year in order to avoid exhausting the soil. And this is a technique that is not just used in subsistence agriculture. I saw this used in rural Minnesota where I grew up, where farmers would not just grow corn every year in the same field. They would grow corn some years and soybeans in other years. But the idea is that you want to not always grow the same thing in a field because that would suck out all of the nutrients. Your next step is going to be use this information to do some mapping, and I hope that this has been helpful. If not, feel free to consult Chapter 9, Section 3, because I think that will help you be able to sort of dig deeper with this material.